Madeleine is the president of what we in the business is called PIC, Population Institute Canada. It's an organization concerned with the implications of human population growth for all life on Earth. Madeleine has been with PIC since its inception in 1992 and its president since 1995. And many, many wars and battles and discussions have gone on since those days. She has a BSc in zoology from the University of Guelph and a Master's of Science and PhD in physiology. I'll see if I can get this anglicized pronunciation correct, from Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. Is that about right? The Americanization of la langue de Molière. She worked at the University of Ottawa for many years, between 1984 and 2001. She's now retired, but she worked on food safety at the Food Directorate of Health Canada, and those are the years when she started to comment about wishing that she were retired. Madeleine is a co-editor of the Humanist Perspectives, a quarterly Canadian magazine, and she used to be the director of the Humanist Association. She also used to be director of Planned Parenthood, and you can see the link there, Planned Parenthood Ottawa. And now, as you probably know, the title she's chosen, this is a good enigmatic one. No one ever dies of overpopulation. Now, here's the lead in 2 sentences. Humanity faces a myriad of ecological, economic, and social problems, many of which have no easy or obvious solution. Every event has many antecedents, and we usually attribute our problems or the occurrence of catastrophic events to the most immediate and obvious antecedents, while overlooking the role of population growth as a major driving factor in creating the conditions for the antecedent events to occur. It's with great pleasure that I ask you to welcome Madeleine Weld to the lectern. Oh, my dear.
Thank you, John.
Another one. Don't get away with just one.
Let's see if I can figure this one out. Thank you, John, for the kind introduction. I'm honored to be speaking to the Canadian Association of the Club of Rome. Now, should I be doing something here? When Madeleine invited me to speak to KCOR, I thought to myself, now what can I tell these people at the Club of Rome that they don't already know? And the answer I came up with is absolutely nothing. So you guys might as well all go home. Because now I'm going to see if I can. There we are. So this can be called the Garrett Hardin talk, maybe. In 1971, Garrett Hardin wrote a paper called "Nobody Ever Dies of Overpopulation," and he was referring to a cyclone that had happened in November of 1970 in East Bengal, in what was then East Pakistan, is now Bangladesh. And he said, early dispatches spoke of 15,000 dead, but the estimates rapidly escalated to 2 million and then dropped to 500,000, a nice round number, for we will never know. The nameless ones who died left no trace of their existence. Pakistani parents repaired the population loss in just 40 days, and the world turned its attention to other matters. So 500,000 people, 40 days. And he continued, what killed those unfortunate people? The cyclone, newspapers say, but one could just as logically say that overpopulation killed them. If Pakistan were not so overcrowded, no sane man would bring his family to such a place. Ecologically speaking, a delta belongs to the river and the sea. Man obtrudes there at his peril. Now, as it happens, maybe you remember in 2010 in Pakistan there were floods, and it said 20 million people were displaced. As it happens, my dad was a diplomat, and we were posted to Pakistan in 1965. And in 1965, the population was 51 million. So in August of 2010, 20 million Pakistanis were flooded out of their home, 20 million. And there had been unusually heavy monsoon rains, and as a result of all the water, there were thousands of cases of cholera from contaminated water. So when the floods happened in 2010, the population had risen to 180 million. Now, if there had only been 51 million people in 2010, I don't think there would have been 20 million displaced. But with 180 million, again, as the Garrett Hardin what he was referring to in Bangladesh, people were living in places that weren't really suitable. Every year we list tuberculosis, leprosy, enteric diseases, animal parasites as the cause of death of millions of people. It's well known malnutrition is an important antecedent of death in these categories, and that malnutrition is connected with overpopulation. But overpopulation is not called the cause of death. We cannot bear the thought. Then he said something I thought was kind of interesting, because we remember the blackouts of 2003, perhaps. And then there were all the heat deaths in Europe a few years later. Hardin said in that paper in 1971, "What will we say when the power shuts down some fine summer on our eastern seaboard and several thousand people die of heat prostration?" Fortunately, that didn't happen, but they were without power for up to a week. Will we blame the weather, or the power companies for not building enough generators, or the eco-nuts for insisting on pollution controls? I don't think anybody blamed overpopulation for the power outage in 2003. At least I don't recall anybody saying, that eastern seaboard, it's pretty overpopulated, and so is southern Ontario. What about conflicts? Is there a population component? Now, we've heard a lot about Syria lately. In 1960, it had a population of 5 million people. With 3% annual growth, it was 22 million in 2010, which is a 4.4-fold increase in 50 years. And there's climate change, increased heat and aridity, and people were moving from farming communities to urban centers where there were low economic prospects, reduced living standards, congestion, and ethnic tensions. But part of where Syria was able to grow crops or fruit is now no longer functioning very well. And what about South Sudan, which we've heard a lot in recent years as well. In 1960, it had a population of 3 million and up to 11 million in 2013. So that's a 3.7-fold increase in 53 years. At a current rate of 4.1% annual growth, that means the population doubles every 17 years. At this rate, the population will be 22 million in 2030 and 44 million in 2047. But the region has thin, dry soils that are already too depleted to prevent famine. And so that's what the ganga weed or whatever the raiders were fighting with the tribesmen who are already living there. So this graph is from a few years ago, but it's the same. You get the picture, and in fact, actually, the projections are a little worse than they're actually shown in that picture. But you can see up until, I don't think you can read the numbers. I don't have a pointer, but starting at about after 1800 is when things start to slowly increase, and then they accelerate very, very rapidly, and we're now increasing by 1 billion people. That's 9 zeros with every 12 or 13 years. And just sort of as a visual, this was a hard copy handout at a meeting I was at, but I scanned it and used it. And it's the gray shows these are all land mammals, and every dot, every square there is 100,000 tons. Oh, that was supposed to be a comma, that second one. Anyway, 1 million tons. And see, humans and their cattle and goats and pigs and stuff, they take up about 95% they make up 95% of the land mammals. The things in green, you see a few green things, those are the wild animals. Elephants are worth about 1 green square, and everything else is us. So one species, Homo sapiens, has certainly taken over. Back when we were hunter-gatherers, would be less than 5% of the total land mass of mammals, and now we're 95%. Let's see here we go. Okay, so back in 1968, the fastest growth rate ever, 2.5% a year. The increment was 73 million people per year. Now our growth rate has slowed, well, in 2010 it had slowed all the way down to 1.2, but the increment was 81 million people. It was more because the base population was so much higher. In 1968 it was below 4 billion people. In 2010 it was almost 7 billion. And currently in 2017, the annual growth rate has gone down further. It's 1.12 now. 1.12, but we're increasing by 83 million people a year. So we're still, the absolute numbers of people are still higher. Okay, will the human population stop growing? Do you remember for a long time people were saying, okay, the population's going to max out at 9.6 billion or 9.4 or 9.3, whatever it was. But, you know, these here at IASA, they're saying 9.4 billion, and then it'll decline. By 2100, it'll go down again. Well, others, the UN also thought, you know, we'd max out at some point. But there was a revision, and they keep revising their numbers. And in the 2012 revision, which was published in June 2013, they projected a world population of 7.2 billion. Okay, over the next 12 years, they were projecting 9.6 billion by 2050. 10.9 billion by 2100, and the big difference is growth will continue. They were projecting continued growth beyond 2100. The population of the developed regions will remain unchanged. It's been unchanged for a long time in terms of natural increase. The population of the 49 least developed countries would double from 900 million to 1.8 billion. And of course, there'd also be population increases in other countries, like even China and India are still increasing, even albeit, especially in China, much more slowly. So this is what the UN said in June of this year. Currently at 7.6 billion. We're heading to 8.6 billion by 2030, 9.8 billion by 2050, and 11.9 billion by 2100. And most of the increase is going to be in just 9 countries. Most of them are very poor or relatively poor countries. I guess Indonesia and the U.S. are not, you know, quite so poor. The USA in that whole list is the only one where the increase is going to be mainly due to immigration. For all of the other countries, it's due to natural population increase. And 47 least developed countries average 4.3 births per woman from 2010 to 2015. Growing at 2.5% a year. And that's the average of the least developed countries. Some, like Niger, the total births per woman is still 7. And that's lower than the desired family size there is actually even higher. So in having only 7 births, they're having fewer kids than a lot of families want. So this gets a little bit complicated, but what's happening here is we see 2 different projections that were made in 2001 and 2014. So the dotted lines, there's all these different colors, but you'll see one line, I don't know if you can see it very well, is dotted. It's the one that's for the top, for the world population. The dotted line sort of is heading down towards 8 billion, like it does a curve, whereas the solid line is heading upward to 11 billion. And what those are the 2001 projections versus the 2014, I think, projection, and the shadowing is our probability estimates. But all these colors are different continents. So North America, purple below, the projected and the projected in 2001 and 2014 are very similar. Europe is the blue line, ditto, they're very similar. Latin America and the Caribbean, they're the orange at the bottom. And you can see that the actual numbers are actually less the later projection is actually lower than the earlier projection. So birth rates fell faster there than projected. Now the green line is Asia, and you can see the later projection is a little bit higher, getting towards 2100, but the difference is not huge. Now you see Africa is the turquoise, purple, whatever color that is, and you can see it The earlier projection, it was going to max out below 2 billion, and now in 2100 it's over 4 billion, and it's expected to be still growing at that point. And that is having the impact on the world projections at the top. And that little blurb that you can't read at the side there, so the big surprise, Africa, a large unanticipated rise, and it accounts for almost the entire increase in the 2100 global projection. So the later data showed that African fertility rates remain higher than predicted, and death rates from AIDS have eased, and so otherwise the Asia is slightly higher, Latin America slightly lower, as pointed out. But so Africa is the big surprise, and this is a paper by John Bongartz, who's a Canadian demographer, and this is just sub-Saharan Africa, and he's talking about two different projections, again, an earlier one and a later one. So things did not work out as people had hoped in the earlier projection. So what were those hopes based on? Well, the world downplayed the importance, this is my summary, downplayed the importance of population growth, focused on AIDS, education, and development. So it focused on indirect ways that it hoped would bring the population down. But preferred family size remained high, and little effort was made to counter cultural norms of high fertility. And even though access to contraception increased in many areas, many misconceptions about the harm it causes prevented its use. There's some crazy myths about what using contraception can do. So the demographic transition theory, I call it put people to sleep theory. No theory did more to make people complacent, in my opinion. The demographic transition theory was embraced by the 1987 Brundtland Commission on Sustainable Development. Remember Gro Harlem Brundtland, who headed it? It advocated sustainable development that would be achieved with economic growth in developing countries, social equity, and environmental protection. And the whole idea was to get everybody at what they called the modest European level of standard of living. Remember that? So how could these be achieved without controlling population growth? And the answer was the demographic transition. People would automatically have fewer children as they became richer. And that was the fond hope that would automatically happen. And the International Conference on Population and Development, well, it went along with that. It was held in Cairo in 1994, and it implemented the Brundtland model. Do you remember what a big to-do was made about that conference? I think it was one of the biggest disappointments in the population field ever. Anyway, the population growth would be reduced indirectly through economic growth in the context of sustainable development, education, especially for girls, gender equity and equality, infant, child, and maternal mortality reduction, universal access to reproductive health services, and including family planning and sexual health. And this is from the ICPD of 1994, for the Program of Action. All couples and individuals have the basic right to decide freely and responsibly the number and spacing of their children, and to have the information, education, and means to do so. And there were strange bedfellows at that 1994 conference, because the feminists were basically in bed with the Vatican. A lot, in the opinion of a lot of people. The Vatican, of course, didn't want to have anything to do with contraception, as it is its want, and the feminists didn't want to have anything to do with population control, because that was racist and colonialist, and it all had to be indirect. I've heard, and I, read this, and I've heard it from people who were there. So it was a wasted opportunity as far as I'm concerned. So the Cairo Program of Action had a lot of good stuff, and it recognized, this is directly from their Program of Action. Rapid population growth in developing countries would put great pressure on the environment. The large proportion of young people in those countries would result in extremely rapid population growth at current fertility rates, and this growth would cause enormous social and environmental problems. And guess what? That was absolutely right. That's absolutely totally what happened. But the Program of Action back in 1994 did not recommend any measures aimed specifically at reducing population growth, such as the promotion of small families through government education programs. In fact, countries that did, like Bangladesh, were attacked by some as being whatever, anti-woman. So now one environmental problem gets almost all the attention, climate change. And I hasten to add that I'm not a climate change denier. But in a recent article by Richard Heinberg, he says, climate change isn't the problem, overshoot is. And, which of the following is not affected by human numbers? Industrial production, which drives climate change, and as countries like China industrialize, they produce more greenhouse gases. Food production drives climate change. This is also a resource depletion driven by human numbers, pollution. These are all problems, habitat and biodiversity loss. There is no problem that we have that is not driven by or exacerbated by human population growth. And this is a graph from Jane O'Sullivan in Australia, and she compares population growth and the correlation between population growth and greenhouse gas emissions. The population data is from the UN, the emissions from the IPCC, and they pretty much go in lockstep because the per capita greenhouse gas production has not gone up globally. And so what is Canada doing to stabilize its population? Well, this is Canada's population growth from 1861 to 2050, and we are growing. In 2010, I think that was our peak year. I don't know if it shows it there. Well, no, I guess it's that's the total population. But in 2010, I think our population increased by 500,000, so almost 500,000. That was the year we had lots of temporary foreign workers, and remember the big fuss there was about that later. But Canada is, unlike other countries, we're not increasing so much by the high fertility because our total fertility is quite low. It's about 1.4. But in Canada's deliberately driving its population growth through immigration. And that is from between 1992. So 1992 was shortly after Mulroney's government said that we'd be increasing our intake or taking in at least 250,000 every year. And that happened. Every government after that, conservative or liberal, continued to take in large numbers of people. And so that proportion changed between 1992 and 2017. I think in 1992 it was about 40%. And in 2017, 75% of Canada's population growth is driven by immigration. And compared to our neighbor to the south, we grew by 1.2%, double the U.S. rate of 0.7, in spite of all the fuss in the U.S. about illegal immigration, of which they have more than we do. But we're still growing at a faster rate, and that's entirely driven by government policies. So there's John Mayer he's got a website called Canadians for a Sustainable Society. And he did some calculations on the oil sands. So bottom line is that every year, because the Alberta oil sands are kind of the bad boy, right, of carbon emissions, but they produce 73 megatons annually. And these calculations are for 2015. Canada's emissions increased from 590 megatons in 1990 to 740 in 2015. i.e. the increase is 150 megatons per year, which is approximately twice what you get from the oil sands. But the per capita rate of emissions has not changed. It's about 20 tons per person. So the increase of GHG emissions in Canada has been driven by the growth of the population. 6 million newcomers since 1990, and instead of having a population of 29 million as we would without hyper-immigration, it's now 35 million. And the current I don't know if you've been reading Doug Saunders' book. What is it? We don't know, No Full House or something. Anyway, he's advocating for a population of 100 million. And there's the Globe and Mail had a few years ago, it had a whole series of articles on people who thought we'd be just more important if we had 100 million Canadians. So at 100 million people, to get greenhouse gas emissions, they tripled to 2,000 megatons, right? 3 times. 740. So to get back to the Kyoto target, we would have to cut per capita emissions by 72%. So that would be really hard to do. But an easy way to cut back on our emissions in Canada would be to stop growing our population. Okay, so here's a bunch of reasons why growing Canada's population through immigration is a bad idea. We don't really need more people. We're high energy consumers. Our environment and farmland are already under pressure. We are taking the best and the brightest from other countries who need them more than we do. I mean, we're also taking a lot of people through other categories, but one of our categories is the skilled immigrant. And, you know, we actually don't need them for the economy. We're providing a safety valve for other countries who should be controlling their own population. Remittances from expatriates in rich countries allow business to continue as usual in sending countries. And some of the big sending countries are the Philippines, Haiti, Egypt, and they all export about 10% of their population. And I guess we just got from the U.S. a bunch of Haitians who were worried that Trump would repeal their temporary permit or whatever it was called after the earthquake of 2011. Remittances from expatriates remove that money from the economy of the country they work in. And as we all know here, the growth forever paradigm cannot continue indefinitely. And this is where I think people who want to grow Canada's population should be sent to live, because that's what 90% of us live within 150 kilometers of the U.S. border. And so we don't really have a big country. We have a big little country or a little big country or something. The populated part of Canada is as densely populated as a lot of other places in the world, in the developed world. This is what Al Bartlett, Professor Emeritus of Physics, Colorado University. Can you think of any problem on any scale, from microscopic to global, whose long-term solution is in any demonstrable way aided, assisted, or advanced by having continued population growth at the local level, the state level, the national level, or globally? I don't think anyone has ever answered Al Bartlett's question about a global any problem that is aided by population growth. And E.O. Wilson said, "The raging monster upon the land is population growth. In its present, sustainability is but a fragile theoretical construct. To say, as many do, that the difficulties of nations are not due to people but to poor ideology or land use management is sophistic." Tell it like it is, Edward. And Arne Nass says, "The flourishing of human life and cultures is compatible with a substantial decrease in the human population. The flourishing of non-human life requires such a decrease." So now I ask, what has growth done for you lately? I mean, what growth has done for me lately is, as my husband says, it's bringing ugly in our direction. We live in Cumberland, and it used to be the boonies, but now Orleans is expanding eastward into Cumberland, so we're getting all these housing developments and stuff like that, and we wanted to be in the boonies. And you know, the more congestion, longer waits in hospitals, I really don't see how growth is benefiting the average Canadian. We can talk about that. Garrett Hardin, in a different article, but in 1989, said, "There is no global population problem." He said, "Never globalize a problem if it can be solved locally. No progress with population problems until we deglobalize them. Populations like potholes are produced locally, and unlike atmospheric pollution, remain local unless some people are so unwise as to globalize them by permitting population excess to migrate to better endowed countries. We are not faced with a single global population problem, but rather with 180 separate national population problems. All population controls must be applied locally. Local governments are the agents best prepared to choose local means. Means must fit with traditions. The only legitimate demand that nations can make on one another is this: do not try to solve your population problem by exporting your excess people to us." Now, I guess that could be considered a bit controversial, but I think we see borders sort of shutting down. And when you think of right now, Africa's got 1.2 billion people, how much better are things going to be if they should ever reach the 4 billion that are projected? So, Hardin in 1991, he said, no, in the same article, nobody ever dies of overpopulation. How can we control population without recourse to repugnant measures? Fearfully, we close our minds to an inventory of possibilities. Instead, we say that a cyclone caused the deaths, thus relieving ourselves of responsibility of this and future catastrophes. Fate is so comforting. Well, so what can Canada do? Stop madly pursuing growth and stabilize its own population. Support family planning by funding ethical programs in countries that are attempting to stabilize and reduce their own populations. Promote population stabilization and reduction at the international level. If anybody consulted me, if Prime Minister Trudeau consulted me, that's what I would tell him. And here we have a cartoon, the population taboo. Nobody ever talks about overpopulation. But maybe we will. That's it. Let the discussion begin.